In the history of warfare, there have been a catalog of inventions that have changed the way battles are fought. The catapult, the longbow, the cannon, the machine gun. But one weapon changed not only the battlefield, but war itself. It extended the scope of military conflict to the far borders of entire nations and unleashed a terror the world had never known. That weapon was the bomber. The bomber emerged in the early 20th century as the most potent symbol of modern war.
In the past, soldiers fought for their families and their loved ones at home in such a way that they thought they were safe there. But the problem with aerial bombardment in the Second World War was the fact that their families and their loved ones were now having to fight their own battles.
So suddenly you're in danger having a cup of tea in your front room.
Sticks of bombs tumbling from the belly of B-24s. Raised buildings. The mushroom cloud. These are images that define World War II. No weapon or weapon system has received as much investment, manpower, or innovation, or been so destructive.
In World War II, air power is a decisive element. You cannot conduct a successful campaign or offense unless you have air superiority.
And it all started with balloons. Almost from the beginning of warfare, armies have looked for ways of hurling destructive objects through space to rain down on the heads of their enemies. The bomber's ancestors are the arrows, the catapults, ballistas, and trebuchets of ancient and medieval war. And with the introduction of gunpowder, they evolved into the cannon, the field gun, and the mortar. Firepower that rains from the sky has a history that advances at an astonishing pace, from its unlikely start in the mid-19th century. In 1849, the Austrian Empire launched 200 pilotless bomb-carrying paper hot air balloons on the Venetian Republic. They caused very little damage, but incited a new kind of terror. Less than a century later, Hiroshima was laid waste. 4 years before the first flight of the Wright brothers, the threat of this new weapon was taken seriously enough for the 1899 Hague Peace Conference to ban the discharge of any explosive from balloons.
Once it was clear that the bomber might be used this way, nations got together and formed international agreements to prohibit specifically that kind of use.
That prohibition was strengthened in the Second Hague Conference in 1907, which decreed that the attack or bombardment by whatever means of towns, villages, dwellings, or buildings which are undefended is prohibited.
The entire issue of the moral issues came out because now you're talking about not just fighting armies of trained soldiers against each other, you're talking about attacking civilians. The general idea was when international lawyers first considered the issues that bombing civilians just for the sake of bombing civilians was in fact not proper under international law.
The seeds for fierce debates about the morality, legitimacy, and effectiveness of bombing were sown, and the debate, which will color this history, continues today.
Those agreements didn't last, unfortunately, very long.
Neither then nor since have nations at war followed rules laid down at peacetime conferences. The Japanese used balloons against Russian forces in Manchuria in 1904 to 1905. and so did the Italians in Libya in 1911 to 1912. But on November 1st, 1911, the Italians went one step further. On November 1st, 1911, Lieutenant Giulio Gavati climbed into the cockpit of his Ettrick Taube monoplane. His mission during Italy's invasion of Libya was to fly over the Ain Zara oasis on a reconnaissance mission. But instead of just flying over the target, Gavati became the first man to claim an aerial bombardment.
Italian bombings were using hand grenades dropped from their cockpits on Ethiopian soldiers as early as 1911. During World War I, bomber technology progressed pretty rapidly.
If aircraft could be made bigger, so could weaponry. The new type of weapon, only remotely related to the grenade, was the bomb. Named after the effect and noise it creates, bombs consist of 5 major parts: an outer casing, devices such as fins to stabilize the bomb in flight, the inner explosive material, one or more fuses to ignite the bomb's main charge, and a mechanism for arming the fuse or preparing it to explode. Bombs differ from artillery shells, missiles, and torpedoes in that they are not propelled through the air or water and travel to their targets through the force of gravity alone. Among the most common types of bombs, a blast for demolitions, fragmentation, general purpose, armor-piercing, and incendiary or fire bombs. But one principle unites them all: the release of contained energy in a sudden, violent way. As the battlefields of the First World War, particularly those on the Western Front, consolidated in a fierce stalemate, the potential for war and destruction from the skies was recognized and championed.
Now the frantic race of inventing, improvising, adapting, and refining aircraft equipment began.
Going into World War I, most nations didn't really have a well-defined plan for how they would use air power against a city. First of all, there was no real way to do it. Most of the aircraft in 1914 could barely lift the pilot off the ground, never mind a meaningful payload, and the range was quite short.
In May 1915, Italy possessed the most advanced bomber fleet of the Western countries. Large tri-motor Caproni, of which more than 800 were built. The largest of them capable of carrying 1 ton of munitions. For various reasons, including a tendency to crash, they did little damage. A more advanced plane was to be found on the Eastern Front. The Sikorsky 4-engine biplane. The most powerful variant, powered by Russian-built Renault engines, could carry almost 800 kilograms of bombs and boasted 7 Lewis guns, 1 lavatory, and a balcony. Its propaganda value was probably greater than its military worth.
At that time, I was certain already that the future of aviation will be connected with fairly large aircraft, that the closed cabin, with its comfort, protection from wind and so forth, represent a must.
Both Britain and Germany developed multi-engine bombers during the Great War, although no country seemed quite sure how to use them as part of a coherent strategy.
The only nation that had the ability to really attack populations from the air at the beginning of the war was the Germans. They had their airships created by Count von Zeppelin around the turn of the century.
And with a Zeppelin, you could carry a considerable load of passengers, or you could carry bombs.
In 1900, Count von Zeppelin, a retired German general, had flown his first airship, the LZ-1, over Lake Constance in southern Germany. The airship stayed aloft for 20 minutes before damaging itself on landing. Designs were quickly adjusted, and Germany was first to mount raids that exploited the range and payload of the airships. Airships were filled with hydrogen, bagged inside a wooden or steel framework. These cells meant that the integrity of the airship's shape was maintained by its rigid frame. Several engines attached to the outside of the frame powered the craft at speeds of up to 140 kilometers per hour. A rudder controlled the airship to port or starboard and the yaw axis. The pitch axis, controlling ascent and descent, was via elevators mounted on the tail. The first sorties predated bombs and dropped artillery shells. The best-known Zeppelin airship is the Hindenburg, famous for the disastrous attempt to dock in New Jersey in 1937.
A roar and a burst of flame near the big tail fins turned the ship into a flaming inferno.
The problem with your airships is that because of their great mass, in any winds over about 30 knots, they're simply unmanageable. Your Zeppelins are also relatively vulnerable. They're filled with hydrogen to ground defenses.
The Zeppelin, vulnerable and unstable, was a less than decisive weapon, but it made the potential of aerial bombing clear. On the 19th of January, 1915, Britain, safe behind the shield of the Royal Navy, was suddenly attacked from the sky. The eastern coastal towns of Great Yarmouth and King's Lynn were hit with 10 bombs. And shoemaker Samuel Smith and 72-year-old Martha Taylor became Britain's first air raid casualties. There were many early casualties among the crowds of sightseers that gathered in the open to watch the show. 13 deaths that followed the Franco-British attack on the German town of Saarbrücken were attributed to townspeople watching the raid, rather than seeking shelter.
Airplanes have great advantages over airships. First of all, they are a small fraction of the cost. They are a lot easier to build than an airship. You can keep them in a very simple hangar, easy to construct.
The Imperial German Air Service quickly capitalized on this.
German aircraft industry managed to produce large conventional aircraft, multi-engine bombers.
The Imperial German Air Force's Gotha twin-engine heavy bomber was the first mass-produced large airplane. The updated G5 had dual Mercedes engines with a maximum speed of only 140 kilometers an hour. Coupled with an estimated stalling speed of 90 kilometers per hour, the pilot had a very narrow corridor in which to fly and maneuver the aircraft.
This is a very capable aircraft. It has defensive machine guns. It is also very slow. We are talking at flying less than 100 miles an hour. Cruise speed is something like 80 knots.
Built by Gotha Wagenfabrik, it had a steel skeleton with wood framing and a fabric skin, later replaced with plywood. Front and rear and later middle machine guns were mounted on trainable ring mounts for arcs of defensive fire. Bombs were hung externally. The average load of the Gotha on a London raid consisted of 6 50-kilo bombs. Over 200 examples were produced in its short production run. The difficulties of combining a combustible payload with robust structure and flying capabilities is evidenced by the fact that more Gotas were lost in flying accidents than in combat with the enemy. The first heavier-than-air raid, a very minor affair, hit London on November 28, 1916. A two-man LVG C-4 crossed the Channel and just before noon dropped 6 22-pound bombs on London, between Hyde Park and Victoria Station, wounding 10.
As the Germans began using these, initially in daylight, where the initial results were quite striking. The British population could not understand how a diamond-shaped formation of German bombers in broad daylight could sweep in almost unopposed and rain bombs indiscriminately down on the population.
Air raids during the First World War caused almost 5,000 casualties in London alone. But despite the loss of life, their actual impact on the outcome of the war was virtually zero.
We're talking really nothing like the mass raids of World War II. We're talking 20, 30 bombers. You have some of the Gotha bombers hitting targets in London. There's one that was hitting Farringdon Road, one hall full of people, 50 dead in one stroke. Now, this, in World War II, nobody would have thought too much about this, but in 1917, this is initially a shock, and it somewhat panics the British government, and it causes public consternation.
The first measurable effect of the rise of the bomber was on civilian morale. The security that civilians felt removed from the battlefield was destroyed by this new weapon. It was estimated that, following an air raid, 90% of the workforce in an affected area would be late for work the next day.
Both sides experiment with bombs. Little destruction results, but attack from the air terrifies defenseless troops on the ground. This is well noted by a young German fighter pilot, Hermann Göring, destined to play a larger role in another war.
Following the armistice of 1918, the role of the bomber and the panic and terror it instilled was rehearsed and refined by Western powers.
The idea of attacking cities and civilians in them in order to wear down the war resistance is attributed initially to an Italian general named Julio Duhay.
Duhay, whose influence is growing somewhat during the 1920s, a number of people read him, is throwing his ideas onto fertile ground, because air power thinkers in the United States, in Britain, Germany, France, as well as Italy, Russia, are all thinking about how the bomber might be used.
And he said at one point that damaging the will and the morale of people is the true objective of bombing. So those two words, will and morale, became code words for what we today would call terror. Duhay said, everyone will become combatants. There will be no distinction whatsoever between soldiers and civilians.
This was the shape of things to come, and it was the introduction of the bomber, far more than any other military aspect of the Great War, that was to influence the politics of the interwar years.
In interwar Europe, there was this growing fear over aerial bombardment. You know, there were films like H.G. Wells' Things to Come in the mid-1930s showing this dystopian bombing future. There were the words of politicians that were terrifying the masses in Britain.
In the Mother of Parliaments, a storm has blown up over the subject of air rearmament. Ever since Germany marched into the Rhine and the era of power politics began all over again, the question of air rearmament has been the nation's most fundamental problem. The government's steadfast reply is, don't panic, and Mr. Chamberlain has stood by his colleague Lord Swinton, the Air Minister. The letter announces the program of 3,500 first-line aircraft by March 1940. Is 3,500 in 2 years' time enough?
The Cambridge academic G. Lowes Dickinson, writing in 1923, summed up the new fear: if mankind does not end war, war will end mankind.
World War I is so devastating to every country involved. The casualties on the ground from trench warfare are so massive that a future war of this type is unthinkable.
If you were a professional military officer and you'd lived through the First World War and you saw tens of thousands of your comrades slaughtered in the trenches, you were professionally committed to finding a better way to fight.
In May 1920, Britain faced an uprising in its Middle Eastern mandate, Iraq. It was quashed, but required the deployment of more than 100,000 troops. The fighting caused the deaths of thousands of Arabs and hundreds of British and Indian soldiers, at a cost to the Crown of tens of millions of pounds. An alternative tactic was required. Winston Churchill, War Secretary in Lloyd George's coalition government, had to balance huge military budget cuts with the British determination to maintain a grip on its far-flung imperial realms. Churchill wrote, "It may be possible to affect economies during the course of the present year by holding Mesopotamia through the agency of the Air Force, rather than by a military force." Churchill named the tactic air control. The defeat of the Iraqi uprising was in part credited to the deployment of a handful of RAF squadrons, led by Churchill's Chief of the Air Staff, Hugh Trenchard.
With the newly formed independent RAF, they're fighting for their very existence against the Army and the Royal Navy in Britain. What we see is the idea of independent air power missions, things that only air power alone can do, being prioritized by Hugh Trenchard. And he has a huge influence on the direction of the RAF in the interwar period.
Their success encouraged the Royal Air Force to believe that bombing alone was enough to win a war. That belief was certainly held by a young officer serving in Iraq named Arthur Harris, who 20 years later would lead Bomber Command through most of the Second World War. In 1935, Benito Mussolini, the fascist leader of Italy, had adopted Adolf Hitler's plans to expand his empire and chose independent Ethiopia as his first target. Italian troops crossed the Ethiopian border, and the first bombs fell on Adowa on October 3rd.
Farther south, a British Red Cross unit takes part in the international errand of mercy as casualties mount and work is speeded, and danger of destruction from Italian bombs which have already blown up some of their buildings and camps and much of their material.
Despite being a signatory to the 1925 Geneva Protocol that banned the use of chemical weapons, Italian bombs included sulfur mustard gas that an Ethiopian leader, Ras Imru, called "this terrible rain that burned and killed." Vittorio Mussolini, youngest son of the Italian leader, was decorated for aerial heroics during the invasion. he bombed undefended villages. He claimed, "The bombing of Adowa failed to give us any satisfaction, owing to the fact that there were only small huts, which flattened out without raising smoke or flames, such as one might see in an American film." On May 5th, 1936, after 7 months of fighting, Marshal Badoglio led victorious Italian troops into the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa. There had been just over 1,000 Italian casualties. Assaulted by bombing, poison gases, and massacre, Ethiopian casualties could not be counted. With his unprovoked attack, he had unhinged the interwar world order. 2 weeks after the invasion, his future ally, Hitler, told his officers, "Rearm and get ready. Europe is on the move again. If we are clever, we will be the winners." The Führer's militarization of the Rhineland, Franco's coup in Spain, and the Anschluss of Austria followed shortly after. But at the beginning of the 1930s, it had not been in Europe or the Middle East that the terror of the bomber was first felt, but in the heavily populated cities of China, who was at war with the Imperial Japanese over Manchuria. On October 8, 1931, Japanese aircraft flew from the Manchurian capital to bomb Qinchao, making plain Japan's ambition to control China's northeastern provinces. Following Chinese boycotts of Japanese goods in response to this action, Japanese naval forces were dispatched to Shanghai in the first major aircraft carrier action in East Asia. At midnight on January 28, 1932, the Japanese seaplane tender Notaro launched several of her E-1Y float planes, already obsolete and capable of carrying just 200 kilograms of munitions, to bomb and strafe the Chapei sector of Shanghai, whose flimsy buildings were easily destroyed. The Chinese Air Force dispatched 9 planes to the Hongqiao aerodrome, and the first aerial battle between Chinese and Japanese aircraft occurred. Neither side suffered losses.
The Chinese Air Force were using a mix of American, British, and Italian, mostly biplane fighters. They had some Martin B-10 bombers, some early model Heinkel HE-111 models, and the Japanese were using their Mitsubishi G3M bomber. G3M was a very good design, and what the Japanese wanted to do with that design was create a bomber with very long range, good speed, and high altitude performance.
The Mitsubishi G3M Rico, a frontline Imperial Japanese twin-engine medium bomber, was utilized in many combat and non-combat roles, centered on maritime sorties, patrol, VIP transport, conventional bombing, and torpedo bombing. With a crew of 7, powered by 2 Mitsubishi Kinsei 14-cylinder air-cooled radial piston engines, the G3M had a maximum speed of 375 kilometers per hour and a long range of 4,400 kilometers.
And this gave the Japanese the advantage of being able to reach targets farther into China, which meant for the Chinese, they had to be able to protect their distant targets, which stretched their fighter force even farther than it was.
Armament comprised of one 20mm Type 99 cannon in the rear dorsal turret, a retractable forward dorsal turret, 2 7.7mm Type 92 machine guns in the cockpit, left and right side positions, as well as unique rear side blister positions. Its payload was 800 kilograms of bombs, or, as specified, 1 aerial torpedo. In October 1934, there was a strike by miners in the Spanish province of Asturias, which threatened to swell into an armed revolution. It failed. The Spanish Air Force bombed its own territory, and troops of the Spanish Foreign Legion and Spain's Army of Africa moved through villages with the brutality of an invading army. They were commanded by General Francisco Franco, who, having suppressed the uprising in 2 weeks at the cost of up to 2,000 lives, was promoted.
The storm center of European politics has moved to Spain, where the elections to the Cortes have caused tremendous excitement. The result has been a definite swing back to the left, in an atmosphere charged with riot hysteria and partisan emotion.
After the election of the left-wing Popular Front government in February 1936, Franco, along with other right-wing generals, was sidelined. He was appointed governor of the Canary Islands, where, on July 17, 1936, he helped launch the Spanish Civil War. The right-wing forces, so-called nationalists, sought to overthrow the newly elected Republican government. They received direct military assistance from sympathetic right-wing regimes: Mussolini in Italy and Hitler in Germany.
And this was really a case of opportunism on the part of Adolf Hitler. He was looking for ways to establish Germany as the leading sponsor of right-wing or fascist movements in Europe.
It was a battlefield in which the world powers could test new weapons and new tactics, with the fascist powers on the right and the Soviets supporting the left-wing Republicans. For 3 years, Spain was a savage battlefield, with acts of shocking violence on every side. Germany sent their volunteer air force, known as the Condor Legion, of approximately 5,000. But Italy committed air and land forces of more than 50,000. Over 100 Italian SM-79s served as bombers for the Aviazione Legionaria in the Spanish Civil War. Of these, only 4 were recorded as being lost in combat. The Italian Savoia Marchetti SM-79 Sparviero, Italian for Sparrowhawk, was a high-speed 3-engine medium bomber, the fastest of its day. Speeds attained were around 430 kilometers per hour at 4,250 meters, with a cruise speed of 373 kilometers per hour at 5,000 meters. Famous for its distinctive fuselage, it was nicknamed Gobbo Maledetto, the damned hunchback. Its combined metal and wood construction was light enough to allow it to stay afloat for up to half an hour in case of water landing, and the large front engine gave some protection against anti-aircraft fire. The SM-79 was heavily armed by 1930s standards, with 5 Breda Safat machine guns. The bomb bay was configured to carry bombs vertically, preventing large bombs from being accommodated internally. With 1,300 SM-79s being produced, they were the most numerous Italian bomber of World War II. In March 1937, at the Battle of Guadalajara, Spanish Republican forces had sent Italian formations into headlong retreat. A few weeks later, German bombers prepared to attack a militarily unimportant town, which has become an enduring symbol of the bombing of civilians. The German Condor Legion arrived over Guernica at 4:30 p.m. on April 26, 1937. with a squadron of Junkers Ju-52s, some Dornier Do-17s, and 3 SM-79 Sparvieros.
If people remember one episode of the air war in Spain, it would have to be the Condor Legion's daylight attack on the market town of Guernica.
They are still equipped with these improvised Ju-52 bombers, which are very primitive bomb sites. They can't hit precision targets. And the best target to hit is a village right behind the lines, because in the village right behind the lines, they will have their logistics, they will have their supplies. You can't hit a precision target, so you just bring in all the bombers and you carpet bomb.
The attack on Guernica killed 1,000 people, 1 in 8 of the town's defenseless population.
Now, the primary objective of the raid was not what we would today call a terror raid, but the fact is, Condor Legion was bombing without regard to the civilian population.
The first recorded use of the term weapons of mass destruction was used in reference to the Guernica bombing.
Hermann Goering, as chief of the German Air Force, said Germany could not do otherwise, as we had nowhere else to try out our machines. Hitler remarked, Franco ought to erect a monument to the glory of the Junkers Ju-52. It is the aircraft that the Spanish Revolution has to thank for its victory. The fame of the raid found prominence through Spain's greatest modern artist, Pablo Picasso, who created a large-scale painting portraying the violence and chaos of the Guernica air campaign.
But these grand ideas of attacking towns and cities cause a kind of panic and reaction that many of the theorists had talked about in the 1920s and 1930s.
But what it does is it creates this myth, is that the Luftwaffe of 1937 could destroy entire cities. Now, your top French and your British politicians are thinking, oh my gosh, they can level Paris.
On August 14, 1937, the Nationalist Republic of China Air Force sortied out to bomb the Japanese flagship Izumo. The Chinese Air Force launched its attacks, arriving over Shanghai, which was covered in thick cloud, with about 40 planes. The pilots had been instructed not to fly over the Shanghai International Settlement, although the Japanese flagship was berthed directly in front of it. The dropped bombs missed the Izumo and exploded in the river, creating huge geysers of water and tidal waves that showered on the enthusiastic Chinese spectators watching from a distance of less than 700 meters. It was not just water that fell from the sky. Shrapnel from the shells of Japanese anti-aircraft guns also rained over the heads of the audience, who quickly ran for cover.
In 1937, the Japanese used bombers to attack Nanking, China, and newsreels of that time showing women and children as bodies lying in the ruins of burned out buildings caused a lot of moral indignation throughout the Western world. Lord Craburn, the British Undersecretary for Foreign Affairs, reacted to the bombing of Nanking with a specific statement. He said, "The military objective where it exists seems to be completely ignored. The main objective seems to be to specifically cause the terror in the bombed population."
Back in Europe, In February 1938, British military intelligence put the combat-ready German air strength at 1,019 bombers. The actual number was 532, none of which had the range to operate against Britain without the capture of advanced airfields. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain confided, "I am pretty satisfied now that if we can keep out of war for a few years, we shall have an air force of such striking power that no one will care to run risks with it."
The Royal Air Force is outnumbered by the Luftwaffe quite significantly. So brute force in this defense of Britain in the skies just isn't an option. And they know, the British authorities know, that something else is needed to utilize this numerically inferior air force against its superior foe.
Fearing a German air attack, the British government set up a research group on remote sensing of aircraft, under the direction of Scottish scientist Robert Watson Watt. The group developed the world's first integrated air defense system and first practical radar, given the codename Chain Home. The system consisted of fixed cable array antenna slung between 3 or 4 110-meter steel towers along the eastern coast of Britain. Chain Home measured the time it took for the pulses to reflect back to the receiver. What made the system unusual was how it measured the direction to the target. Conventional radars measure direction by sending and receiving the radio energy in narrow beams, like a flashlight. Chain Home relied on antennas that illuminated a huge area, like a floodlight.
Now, the Chain Home radar stations on the cliff tops and coastal areas, they have these huge 360-foot steel transmission towers, those sending out the radar pulses. It shows up on a cathode ray tube as a blip, or a kind of anomalous factor. And that includes the bearing, the direction of travel, the speed that the aircraft is traveling at, how many aircraft are coming, is it one or is it a group? All kinds of information that can be useful in terms of air defense.
Chain Home radar operators chose a target, or blip, on their screen and turned the knob of a special instrument to read the direction to the target. By the outbreak of war in September 1939, there were 21 operational Chain Home stations. Thanks to Chain Home radar, the British would lose just over 900 aircraft and save about half of their pilots during the Battle of Britain. In 1939, Hitler tore up the Munich Agreement for the cession to Germany of the Sudeten territory in Czechoslovakia, which had been signed on September 30th, 1938, and moved to annex the whole of Czechoslovakia. On the 14th of March, 1939, the Czech president, Emil Hacha, was summoned to Berlin and told what would happen if his troops resisted. Goering threatened that the Luftwaffe would bomb Prague, his historic capital. Hacha, after suffering an apparent heart attack, ordered Czech troops to stand down. The world was one step closer to war. On the 1st of September, 1939, at 4:45 a.m., the German battlecruiser Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish fort of Westerplatte in Danzig, modern Gdansk. At that moment, 1.5 million German soldiers in 67 divisions, with 3 Slovak divisions in support, surged into Poland.
The Germans went to war on 1 September 1939 against Poland, launching what, in retrospect, is seen as the first Blitzkrieg campaign, even though Blitzkrieg was an idea that was still developing.
Hitler made it clear to the Allies how he intended to fight his war. Relentless bombing raids would be integral to the campaign. 4 Luftwaffe medium bomber groups comprising Junkers Ju-52s, Heinkel He-111s, and Dornier Do-17s with fighter escorts attacked and bombed the airfields, rail yards, and fortifications of the Polish capital, Warsaw.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
On November 10th, 1932, British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, speaking in the House of Commons, had declared, "I think it is well also for the man in the street to realize that there is no power on earth that can protect him from being bombed. Whatever people may tell him, the bomber will always get through."
In a sense, that was true. Most bomber formations during the Second World War got to their destination and bombed their targets.
In less than a century, the bomber had risen from a simple balloon to a weapon of devastating destruction. Guernica, Shanghai, and Warsaw hinted at what the bomber could do. In the war now beginning, bigger and better bombers in ever greater numbers would redefine terror and change the world forever. In the history of warfare, there have been a catalog of inventions that have changed the way battles are fought. The catapult, the longbow, the cannon, the machine gun. But one weapon changed not only the battlefield, but war itself. It extended the scope of military conflict to the far borders of entire nations and unleashed a terror the world had never known. That weapon was the bomber. With the advent of Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland in September 1939, the single deadliest conflict in history had begun. The new machines and weapons, with the lessons learned in Africa, China, and Spain, were now turned on Poland. If the trench defined the First World War, it was clear from the first day of fighting that this war would be defined by a weapon that could strike anyone, anywhere. The impact of the coming war in Europe rippled across the world, where the Second Sino-Japanese War was in its third year. The Empire of Japan's Imperial General Headquarters authorized a terror attack on the Chinese wartime capital of Chongqing. The first raid was on May the 4th, 1939. The Chinese city was packed with refugees, and the raid killed 2,000. Using a combination of high explosives and incendiary bombs, the bombers destroyed almost a third of Chongqing's houses and severely damaged another third. But the strategy failed to affect civilian morale as intended. Over the next 4 years, according to incomplete statistics, a total of 268 air raids were conducted on Chongqing, involving up to 200 Japanese G-3M bombers in each raid. The death toll by the end of the war is unknown. The success of the German blitzkrieg on Poland had already taken on legendary status. By September 6, 1939, the Luftwaffe had destroyed the Polish Air Force and lost only 10% of its aircraft.
The first thing that you want to do in an air campaign is to gain air superiority. When you gain air superiority, then you are free to carry out the other tasks. The Poles are reliant upon the rail system to provide their military mobility and logistics. And so the key rail junctions all throughout Poland are massively bombed by the Luftwaffe. And this inhibits the Poles from moving their rather large, fairly capable ground army to where it's needed.
Approaching Warsaw by the 8th of September, howling dive bomber Stukas attacked Polish army positions on the east bank of the Vistula River. 5 days later, Warsaw's western suburbs were turned into a raging inferno by squadrons of bombing Ju-52s.
The Junkers 52, which is a passenger and cargo aircraft, carries about 3 tons of cargo, 17 or so passengers, and it's rugged. It's a very efficient, popular airliner.
The Ju-52 had a wingspan of 29.5 meters and measured 18.9 meters from nose to tail. As versatile as any aircraft ever built, it could be equipped to work in various terrains. Landing gears could be wheels, skis, or floats. It was powered by British engines, Armstrong Siddeley radials later replaced by Rolls-Royce engines, with a top speed of 265 kilometers per hour. The Flying Toolshed, as it was known, first saw military action as a transporter, becoming a bomber flying for the Colombian Air Force in the Chaco War between 1932 and 1935, and in the Spanish Civil War, flying with the German Condor Legion in the attack on Guernica.
This is Germany's first bomber force. It is not much of a bomber, but you're training the people and you have well-organized units for the time when your real bombers, your purpose-built modern bombers, can replace these transports.
The Flying Toolshed would fly its final bombing mission as part of the Luftwaffe's upcoming Black Monday raid on Poland, before being superseded by purpose-built bombers like the Dornier 17 and the Heinkel 111. By September 25th, 1939, Warsaw was surrounded. The Polish capital's air defense was limited to just 96 anti-aircraft guns. no match for the unprecedented might of the incoming Luftwaffe bombers.
The Germans launched a punishing attack, which probably qualified as a terror attack, with incendiaries attacking Warsaw, hoping to force the Poles to capitulate.
It was the largest air raid to date and became known as Black Monday. Over 400 planes with 632 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs flew 1,150 sorties, causing large-scale devastation. International press reports estimated between 20,000 to 40,000 civilians killed.
The Germans bombed Warsaw with the specific intent of clogging Polish roads with civilians fleeing the terror.
The bombing sunk Polish morale. After the fall of 3 key defensive forts on September 27th, Warsaw surrendered. And on the 29th, the country was occupied.
The campaign was over in 4 weeks, so the Germans could look back on the Polish campaign and say this was an effective baptism of fire.
The United Kingdom and France had declared war on Germany after the invasion of Poland. But no major military action followed. There were months of stalemate and inaction in Western Europe in what was dubbed the Phony War. The British and French built up their forces in expectation of a long war. Tensions rose. The French, thought to be the most powerful army in Europe, fortified their Maginot Line, while the Germans built up their opposing Siegfried Line. The Wehrmacht had 135 divisions containing 2.7 million men, but faced a numerically superior enemy.
The Germans were generally outnumbered in most areas in 1940 when they started the campaign in the West. The Allies, the British and the French, initially later joined by the Belgians, briefly by the Dutch, had more tanks, they had more troops. Technically, in some ways, they had more aeroplanes.
Britain, France, and Belgium, who combined had 130 divisions containing 3.7 million men, ignored the lessons from the defeat of Poland. The Western Allies spread more than 3,000 tanks thinly along the entire front line. German forces concentrated 2,700 tanks in 10 armored columns. And on May the 10th, 1940, Hitler commenced Operation Fallgelb. The battles of France, the Netherlands, and Belgium had begun. British and French commanders rushed forces to the Franco-Belgian border to meet the German attack head-on. The main German assault, however, went through the heavily forested Ardennes in southeastern Belgium and northern Luxembourg.
The Germans took an enormous gamble People blame in particular the French leadership. They think that the French generals weren't up to the job. They were thinking in terms of older tactics and strategies, relying on the Maginot Line, which clearly had no place in modern warfare. The Germans took an enormous gamble. They had less tanks, they had less trucks, they even had less aircraft than the Allies did, but they utilised them better in a more effective plan.
German tanks, supported by Luftwaffe dive bombers and fighters, took only 3 hours to cover the 30 miles from the eastern border of independent Luxembourg to the southeastern border of Belgium. The Belgian Aéronautique Militaire lost 83 of its 179 aircraft within 24 hours. German medium bombers decimated Dutch airfields, followed by waves of airborne infantry and paratroops jumping from Ju-52s aimed at capturing the Dutch government in The Hague. But were initially repelled by Dutch ground forces with heavy casualties.
But the Germans had a flexible, multi-role air force. If they needed to attack a city, they had the capability to do so. They were also able to attack roads, bridges, troop concentrations. So you really have bombardment aviation in Poland and the French campaign employed across a wide spectrum of operation.
There were just 250 British RAF aircraft in France. That number was halved in the first 2 days of battle.
The forces that make up British Air Forces in France are not ideally suited to this role. One aircraft in particular, the Fairey Battle, is outdated almost as soon as it comes off the production line in 1936, but it's all that's available to conduct a strategic bombing raid.
The Fairey Battle was slower than its German opponents, less nimble, and not as well armed. In a desperate attempt to stop German forces crossing the Meuse, the Advanced Air Striking Force launched an all-out attack with all available bombers.
The commander of the British Air Forces in France, who authorises this mission, asked all the crews of the battle aircraft that are on duty that afternoon to step forward on a volunteer basis only. And it said that after he'd ordered that attack, he nearly had a nervous breakdown. Such was the pressure and how he knew what was going to happen to these crews.
What you see on the 14th of May, 1940 at Sedan, in which the Germans are trying to cross the Meuse. They're trying to break through a pretty strong French defense line. And for hours, German bombers, German Stukas, supported by fighters, will be continuously bombing and harassing the entire French defense line. This constant aerial barrage lasting several hours throughout the entire day is really demoralizing for the French troops.
On that same day, May 14, 1940, Rotterdam went from being a bustling port city to a wasteland in the space of 13 minutes.
It's not, however, just about tactical air power, attacking tanks and enemy troops at the front line in response to German army requirements and demands. It's much more fluid than that. They carry out raids against enemy towns and cities with an immediate shock impact.
The port of Rotterdam offered not only close proximity to Great Britain, but also access to important waterways. In just 13 minutes, 24,978 homes, 24 churches, 2,320 stores, 775 warehouses, and 62 schools were destroyed. a reported 900 people died, and 85,000 more were left homeless. One day after the Rotterdam Blitz, the British policy of bombing only military targets and infrastructure was abandoned, and the Royal Air Force was directed to attack targets in the Ruhr. 99 RAF bombers hit the oil refineries and railways of the Ruhr, but inadequate bomb sites, navigation, and technical apparatus caused payloads to be scattered over large areas.
One thing that every Air Force in the Second World War learned in its turn, and they learned it the hard way, was that the theory of putting a bomb onto a small target from high altitude was an extraordinarily difficult proposition. Bombing accuracy, bombing effectiveness was nowhere near up to pre-war expectations.
It was even more difficult if you didn't have a fully functioning and updated bombing fleet. When Britain went to war, the RAF was still flying legacy aircraft from the previous war. Like the Handley Page Hayford, a biplane bomber with huge wheels that did not retract. Navigation was based on the techniques perfected aboard sailing ships, and bombing accuracy was, according to the Assistant Chief of RAF Air Staff, very poor indeed. One effective and elegant exception, the Vickers Wellington, bore the brunt of Bomber Command's early work.
When the war began, the RAF Bomber Command was relatively small in numbers and types of aircraft. The Vickers Wellington was probably the best of the lot.
The twin-engine Vickers Wellington, affectionately known as the Wimpy, was a long-range medium bomber designed in the mid-30s. The Wellington was powered by a pair of Rolls-Royce Goshawk engines with a range of 4,500 kilometers and a bomb load of 2,000 kilograms. Innovation of the Wellington was its geodesic construction, devised by scientist Barnes Wallis.
Barnes Wallis, he had really created this really sturdy aircraft. You know, he had pioneered the principles of geodesic construction. So this is looking at creating a bit of a cross lattice within the body of the aircraft that made it incredibly strong and able to take a lot of damage. Now, of course, at this period, the twin bombers are not particularly fast.
Though a great improvement on the Handley Page, its slow speed, limited ceiling, and small bomb load soon revealed the Wellington's weakness in daytime bombings.
Their bomb loads were small, and their ability to find targets and hit targets, even during the daytime, was limited. Some of the very first raids that were launched by the Wellingtons were met by fierce German fighter interception and flak, and they suffered heavy losses. And for that reason, the British decided to switch to night bombing using those types of aircraft.
The Wimpy was armed with twin .303 Browning machine guns in the tail, waist, and nose. The nose turret was a Fraser-Nash type, also used later on the Lancaster. It was the first to drop the deadly blockbuster bomb during a raid on Emden. Despite its obvious shortcomings, the Wellington was an RAF stalwart, operating from the day after war was declared to the last raid on Treviso in northern Italy in April 1945. A total of 11,461 of all variants were built, the most of any British bomber design. On May 19th, under intense pressure from the advancing Germans, General John Gort, commanding the British Expeditionary Force, resorted to a fighting withdrawal to the last port not in German hands, Dunkirk.
End of May 1940, the British, French, Northern armies have been trapped in northern France. The British defense at Calais and Boulogne will actually delay the German advance towards Dunkirk, where they begun evacuating.
On May 23rd, the fast-moving Germans were closer to Dunkirk than most of the retreating Allies. But with the root and branch of the British Army in its sights, German forces were issued with the still controversial halt order.
Most of the generals post-war blamed Hitler, who they said possibly was trying to spare the British a terrible defeat as the basis for negotiations. There's also evidence from the war diaries that the German operational commanders, worried about their flanks and their supply situation and the state of their armored forces, that they had argued for an operational pause to gather themselves. Either way, the German advance is stopped.
Commander-in-Chief of the German Air Force, Hermann Goering, rejoiced. The final kill would be left to his Luftwaffe, which he confidently said could finish off the armies trapped at Dunkirk. But when the German offensive resumed 3 days later, on May 26th, the Allies had established positions from which to defend their evacuation. The Do-17 and He-111 fast-medium bombers pounded Allied supply columns, railways, depots, fortifications, and bases. The distinctive greenhouse nose makes the Einkel He-111 perhaps the best recognized German bomber of the Second World War. With twin Jumo 211 F2 engines, the He-111 had a top speed of 440 kilometers per hour and a range of 2,300 kilometers. It held a crew of 4: pilot, navigator bombardier nose gunner, ventral gunner, and dorsal gunner radio operator. It had armaments of up to 7 machine guns in the front, topside, and bottom turrets, with a bomb load of up to 2,000 kilograms internally or 2,500 kilograms on 2 external racks. It was extremely versatile and the most prolifically produced of the German bomber fleet. By the war's end, over 7,500 had been built. The Luftwaffe attacked the Dunkirk beachhead with typical gusto, flying 1,882 bombing sorties and 1,997 fighter sorties against the beleaguered British forces.
The Luftwaffe intended to stop the British evacuation by bombing the ships. And they had some success. There were significant losses in the ships. But the Luftwaffe underestimated the capability of the RAF to provide air cover over the beach.
The RAF had worked very hard on strategic air defense, and those forces were able to offer a blanket over the Dunkirk evacuation, or at least contest the area against German air forces.
On June the 4th, the Germans finally broke through the Allied defenses and raised the Nazi flag over Dunkirk. But it was too late. The German army commanders wrote in their diaries, "The town and the coast are in our hands," but they noted, British and French troops gone.
While the British Army was defeated in the field, it was not destroyed in terms of their morale. There was a sense once they got across the channel that they could regroup, that the war was going to continue in a different form.
Barely a week after the last troops had been evacuated at Dunkirk, unable to recover from the devastating shock and humiliation at the hands of the Germans, France sued for peace. Britain now stood alone.
We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
Churchill knew, as every Briton knew, that the seas which had protected them from invasion for centuries were no longer a defense.
So the fact that the Germans were able to defeat France so completely in 8 weeks, it caused general consternation and shock. It gave the Germans an unrealistic sense of their own abilities as well.
In Western Europe, Britain waited for the invasion that seemed sure to come.
The Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin.
Churchill was right, but the battle would not be fought on the beaches, landing grounds, fields, streets, and hills. It would be fought in the sky. Hermann Goering gleefully reported, "The Führer has ordered me to crush Britain with my Luftwaffe." The first phase of the Battle of Britain commenced on July the 10th, 1940.
The Battle of Britain tends to be defined within these different phases. So the opening phase is this Kanalkampf, or this channel battle. And this is the point at which the Luftwaffe is trying to sort of soften up the island by going for its shipping and convoys.
Goering opposed the RAF with 3 main divisions. Luftwaffe numbers 2 and 3, numbering over 1,300 frontline aircraft flying out of France and Belgium, and Luftwaffe 5, flying from Denmark and Norway across the North Sea.
The Luftwaffe would not have had the success it did during the early part of the war with its bomber arm if it did not have a superior fighter plane whose mission was to win and hold air superiority. And it's difficult to see how the Blitzkrieg, how the early German March of Conquest could have happened without the raw capability of the Messerschmitt 109 fighter plane.
The Me-109 is a great fighter airplane, one of the great ones of World War II. On the other hand, the British Spitfires are equal in capability, really, to the Me-109. Each one has certain advantages. The Me-109 can climb faster. The Spitfire has a much tighter turning radius, is more maneuverable in certain maneuvers. They're really equal aircraft, but the Luftwaffe intelligence underestimates their opponent to an enormous degree.
As well as the Spitfire proving a match for the Me-109, the Ju-87 Stukas that had so effectively terrorized troops and civilians in Poland and France was not as effective when it came to attacks across the English Channel. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, with its Banshee dive-bombing sound, was the most iconic German bomber of World War II.
Stuka is just a shortened term for Sturzkampfflugzeuge, which means dive bomber. And the Stuka is a very accurate precision bomber.
So for accuracy, it was one of the most precise weapons in the arsenal in the early part of the war. Its great weakness, though, was without air superiority, the Stuka was terribly vulnerable. And on every front where the enemy Air Force managed to put up modern fighter opposition, the Stuka very quickly disappeared from daylight operations.
The aircraft's design limited its maneuverability and flying speed. All metal in construction, it had a fixed spatted undercarriage, inverted gull wing, and a subdivided airframe, which allowed transport by road or rail.
It was quite easy to fly. It was very, very rugged. It could deploy to frontline airstrips and operate close to the front to give it more loiter time over the target area. It could take a lot of punishment. It had to because it was very slow. That was a sitting duck.
It played quite an important role in the invasion of Russia in 1941. The Russian Air Force had been swept out of the way for a long period of time. And even later in the war, it could play a role because on the Eastern Front, proportionally, there weren't as many defending aeroplanes to stop it from playing a role.
The Stuka had a maximum speed of 340 kilometers an hour, but a diving attack speed of 600 kilometers an hour. Armament comprised front and rear 7.92 millimeter MG-17 machine guns, or a payload of 500 kilos when flown with a single pilot. To initiate a dive bomb, the pilot activated the automatic dive brakes, then rolled 180 degrees into a diving angle of 60 to 90 degrees. The iconic Banshee sirens, known as Jericho trumpets, wailed with the onrush of air during the dive. When it was within 450 meters, the pilot released a U-shaped crutch, which swung the bomb down onto the target. The aircraft then automatically began a 6G pullout, and once leveled out, the pilot regained control. But physical stress on the crew caused by the steep dive was severe. Pilots suffered vision impairment from the G-force, which came to be known as seeing stars.
30 enemy aircraft over the Channel, flying due west.
The Kanalkampf drew out RAF planes, while the Luftwaffe Junkers Ju-87s, escorted by Bf-110s and Bf-109s, attacked the Royal Navy and British commercial ships in Portland Harbor and Naval Base. These attacks marked the worst loss of life of British-based military personnel. But even as some of Britain's defensive force fell, they were replaced by women. An integral part of the home front defense supporting every facet of the RAF was the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, established in 1939. At its peak, there were 180,000 women enlisted for the WAAF.
Target, please, observe. End of series. Read numbers. 8128.
So they are servicing aircraft, they're keeping the fighter crews going, cooking for them, all those kinds of things. But the much less well-known elements of what they did in the Battle of Britain, some of them are serving in coastal radar stations. They are the ones in front of the cathode ray tubes, reading the plots that are coming in from the radar technology. Then in the filter center, they are the ones carrying out the filtering, the analyzing process. They're producing the track of information, and then they are plotting it on the big map. Then when you get to the operations rooms, they are the ones stood around the table with the headsets that they're pushing the wooden blocks around the table that are telling the RAF High Command where these incoming raids are, what they're doing, what they're expected to do.
The defensive system that was created to assist Fighter Command in 1940 was one that was based on radar to detect incoming aircraft from over the Channel coast, and this provided around 30 minutes of warning time, which was just about sufficient to enable the squadrons to get airborne.
So when you have these Luftwaffe pilots over the coast wondering why they're being met before they've even got to where they're going by British defenders, that's because this system is working so well, and so they knew that Britain had radar technology, and what they did not do was fully understand or react to that in the way that they would have needed to.
Kanalkampf placed mounting pressure on Fighter Command. The attrition of continuous patrols, tired pilots, delayed training, and growing numbers of damaged fighters all demanded critical attention.
Other issues for the Luftwaffe include, of course, the famous British weather. They also have issues with the psychological aspect of attacking the British Isles because so many Luftwaffe personnel were terrified of the channel and even called it the Shite Canal because of the fact that it was so terrifying that they might possibly drown in these waters.
Between the first air raid on July the 10th and the middle of August, the German strategy, essentially Goering's strategy, had been to try and draw British fighters into combat by attacking convoys at sea. It had become clear that the RAF was not taking his bait. If he could not draw the RAF out, he would attack them directly. A coded message intercepted by British intelligence read, "To all units of Luftflottes 2, 3, and 5, within a short period, you will wipe the British Royal Air Force from the sky. Heil Hitler." This new strategy was Adlerangriff, Eagle attack. Adlertag, Eagle Day, was launched August 13th. Hundreds of aircraft in 4 successive assaults attempted to break the southeastern defenses. The Luftwaffe flew 1,786 sorties against British airfields. It lost 76 of its aircraft. The RAF lost 35 in the air.
Unternehmen Adlerangriff, or Operation Eagle Attack, was this intensification of the Luftwaffe's offensive against Britain. So going for the RAF, going for its airfields, going for its radar installations, and trying to paralyse the RAF quickly in case there needed to be an invasion of Britain in Operation Sea Lion.
When the Battle of Britain began and the Germans started to employ their bomber fleets, predominantly Heinkel 111s and Junkers 88s, the main of the twin-engine bombers they had available and Dornier 17s in reasonable numbers, the problem they encountered was that the further you got away from your protecting fighters, the more vulnerable the bombers became, and the idea of the bomber being able to look after itself against high-performance enemy fighters really started to be exposed as being flawed. It didn't work.
Any claims, Johnny? 109 destroyed, buddy, yes. Oh, good show.
How'd you get on, sir?
I had a wonderful party, thanks.
Are you all right? You get any of the batters?
Yes, I got a Messerschmitt 109 and a Dornier.
Many of the airfields were in the southeast of England, and the skies over that part of the country came to be known as Hellfire Corner. Below them, on Downs and Headland, crowds assembled to cheer each British kill. In that small, vapor trail-laced piece of sky, more fighter pilots died than in the whole of Britain put together. In early 1940, Britain had been producing 256 fighter planes a month. Winston Churchill, recognizing the urgency of improving output, needed a new minister for aircraft production.
Lord Beaverbrook was appointed the Minister for Aircraft Production in an attempt to try and streamline the procurement processes that had been undertaken by the Air Ministry before the Second World War, and also to increase the outflow of aircraft from the factories that were producing them.
Well, how long have you been working at Vickers, old boy?
Oh, about 6 years or so. How'd you like our plane?
Oh, they're damn good machines. Actually, though, we don't want to carry this war on too long. You must turn them out as fast as you can.
We'll turn out just as quick as we can and as many as we can.
That's the stuff.
Lord Beaverbrook, his major achievement was in the creation of the Civilian Repair Organisation, which would take damaged aircraft from the Battle of Britain and allow them to be repaired in factories outside of the aircraft industry structure, maintaining the outflow from these factories, but also allowing more numbers to be brought back to squadrons with aircraft that could be repaired in order to maintain the numbers that were so vital for taking on the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain.
Under Beaverbrook's management, production for the month of July climbed from 256 to 496 completed aircraft. An article in Time magazine in 1940 drew attention to his record and presciently noted that this war is a war of machines. It will be won on the assembly line. In the third phase of the Battle of Britain, between August 24th and September 3rd, the attacks launched by the Luftwaffe on airfields and aircraft factories cost Germany 380 planes. The RAF lost 286.
Frankly, I think that the Germans never really had a great chance of winning the Battle of Britain. If you think that they only had a few weeks, they had very limited intelligence and understanding of their enemy.
On August 24th, 1940, a Heinkel dropped its bombs on central London. It is often suggested that the incident was an unfortunate error. In fact, it was an indication of Hitler's growing impatience, having ordered Goering to target Britain's civilian population to break their morale. Bombs fell on widely different parts of the capital, at times ranging from 11 p.m. to 3:40 the following morning. A furious Churchill ordered immediate retaliation against Berlin. The character of the air war was about to be transformed. On the night of August the 25th, 1940, 91 Vickers Wellington and Handley Page Hampton British bombers took off for Berlin. Only about half of them reached the capital, which was obscured by dense clouds. Little damage was done, but one bomb killed the only elephant in the Berlin Zoo.
Theoretically, the RAF are very well prepared for the strategic bombing campaign that they will undertake in the Second World War. They have had 20 years to think about what they're going to do, but what they've neglected to think about are the tactics that they will carry out, the navigation required, the aircraft that are needed, and so they enter the war largely unprepared as a physical force to conduct the raids that are needed.
Hitler and Nazi leadership was shocked. Goering had given the personal assurance that such a thing could never happen. It happened again on the night of August the 28th, damaging buildings and causing civilian casualties. And 2 nights later, a third attack occurred.
Both sides planned to bomb cities. They planned initially for bombing the strategic centers that would allow the front line to continue its operations. But once emotions got involved, there was an inevitable progression to the idea of bombing the enemy, whoever he was, the civilians, the civilian centers.
In Führer Directive 17, Clause 5, Hitler gave himself further license to reserve to myself the right to decide on terror attacks as measures of reprisal. He now exercised that right publicly. On September the 4th, he promised, when the British Air Force drops 2 or 3 or 4,000 kilograms of bombs, then we will in one night drop 150, 230, 300, or 400,000 kilograms. When they declared that they will increase their attacks on our cities, then we will raise their cities to the ground. We will stop the handiwork of those night air pirates, so help us God. But as with so many of Hitler's bellicose threats, it was one his Air Force was unable to carry out. On September 7th, just before 4 p.m., British radar lit up, reporting hundreds of aircraft approaching. The RAF sent up 11 squadrons to intercept further attacks on airfields and installations. But on this afternoon, airfields were not the target. For 56 of the following 57 days and nights, the Luftwaffe threw everything it had at London as the Battle of Britain gave way to the Blitz. The Battle of Britain was lost, and in Hitler's hands, the bomber had transformed from strategic strike aircraft aimed at destroying supply lines and infrastructure into a weapon of terror. In the history of warfare, there have been a catalog of inventions that have changed the way battles are fought. The catapult, the longbow, the cannon, the machine gun. But one weapon changed not only the battlefield, but war itself. It extended the scope of military conflict to the far borders of entire nations and unleashed a terror the world had never known. That weapon was the bomber. At the outbreak of World War II, early bombing campaigns were focused primarily on military and strategic targets. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain told the House of Commons, "Whatever be the lengths to which others may go, His Majesty's government will never resort to the deliberate attack on women and children for purposes of mere terrorism." But as the war progressed and the Nazi leadership became ever more immoral and desperate, these lofty ideals became ever harder to maintain.
It's an easy move from the idea of attacking materials and railroads and lumber yards and things like that to the idea of attacking the personnel themselves.
Churchill said, "The Navy can lose us the war, but only the Air Force can win it." And he was in no doubt how. "The fighters are our salvation," he said, "but the bombers alone provide the means to victory." On Friday, the 1st of September, 1939, on the eve of a formal declaration of war, 3 million people began to be evacuated from British cities.
A new exodus from London takes place. Young people whom their parents had wisely registered for evacuation taking train for the West Country. As before, they are under the care of their teachers. It's a wrench for their parents, but the youngsters go off cheerily enough, and there's no doubt they will be safer where they are going.
How is it possible for them to understand that the routine of their daily lives has been shattered by one man hundreds of miles away in a country they have never seen? It is indeed a strange experience for these thousands of children, as well as a great responsibility for those who will be caring for them during these dark days.
Cinemas, dance halls, and theaters were closed. The first blackout was instituted at 7:47 p.m. No street lighting was turned on. No light was allowed to escape from any door or window, and motor vehicles could not use their headlights.
Cities like London were actually very well prepared for aerial bombardment. So in 1937, there had been the Air Raid Precautions Act, which meant that Britain's aerial defences had been galvanised, not only in the anti-aircraft auxiliaries, but also with personnel, with the air raid wardens. There had been the issuing of gas masks. There had been the building of shelters. There had been the issuing of pamphlets and leaflets on information on protecting your family from the air war.
While these hours of destiny draw out, the citizen makes his preparations. Windows are darkened to render blackouts complete.
Germany, on the other hand, had made few preparations for civil defense. Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering the chief of the Luftwaffe, had personally pledged that no enemy bomber would ever reach the Reich. But by the end of the war, RAF Bomber Command had launched 390,000 raids on Germany, and, along with the United States Army Air Force, had destroyed 15% of German housing in 3 years. The shocked Nazi leadership and Army High Command were forced to reevaluate their strategy. As early as June 1940, following the fall of France, Alfred Jodl, Chief of Staff of the German High Command, had said, "Occasional terror raids announced as reprisals will paralyze the people's will to resist and eventually break it altogether." Across the Channel at the beginning of July, Winston Churchill was determined to meet fire with fire.
Winston Churchill wrote his Minister of Supply, Lord Beaverbrook, that the only options that he could see were an absolutely devastating, exterminating attack on the enemy from our country. I think it's interesting to note that that word exterminating seems to suggest a wider idea of exterminating the population of Germany.
Launched in July in the first major military campaign fought entirely by air forces, German formations attacked the Channel, then the Royal Air Force, its airfields and air defenses, believing this was the necessary first step toward defeating Britain. An attack on the civilian population would come later.
After the Battle of Britain concludes and Germany has not achieved what it wanted to in terms of being able to launch Operation Sea Lion of the invasion of Britain, hasn't managed to do that, has not gained air superiority over the Royal Air Force, the tactics change.
Taught by the Great War and German propaganda to expect a fierce blitzkrieg, we have stood ready for the assault on our city.
The Blitz is this sustained aerial attack against the British population now, rather than just military targets. And the reason for that is to try a different tack. We're going to try to destroy British morale with this sustained aerial campaign.
Just before 4 in the afternoon of September 7th, calls started to come in from the RAF chain-home radar operators. Colored counters were slid across plotting tables representing the largest raid to date. 348 bombers flying with cover from 617 fighters. The established pattern of attack was for large German formations to fly towards Britain and then divide into small groups, making for individual targets. This time was different.
They had a rough understanding of which towns and cities in the UK were of economic importance, where most of the major war industries were, but what we would consider targeting science was still in its infancy.
The target was the London docks, which had over 70 kilometers of quays and moved a third of the United Kingdom's imports and a quarter of its exports. The fires reached into the sky and burned all night. Many ships and their cargoes were lost. Warehouses full of paint, rubber, whiskey, sugar, and spice went up. Only 47 of the raiders were lost. Reichsmarshal Goering went on the radio, his tone triumphant, telling listeners he was now in charge of the battle and that his Air Force had delivered a stroke straight to the enemy's heart. He promised that more would follow. The next day, on September 8th, 200 German bombers attacked London's power stations and railway lines. The bombers came back the next day and the next. From that September 7th until the 13th of November, with one exception when operations were cancelled due to bad weather, an average of 160 aircraft raided the British capital every night. The Queen inspected the damage to her palace, commenting with some defiance that she now at least felt able to look the East End in the face. The head of German radio flew along on one of the first raids. He reported to his listeners that what he saw was the fires of destruction consuming the center of plutocrats and slaveholders, the capital of world enemy #1. Famously, Londoners took shelter on the platforms of the underground railway system. A case of myth running away with the facts. Only 4% of the city's population ever used the London Underground for night shelter. 9% used official shelters. The rest preferred to stay at home, in their bed or living room armchairs, or in one of the do-it-yourself air raid shelters that had been approved.
There were two main options for shelters for civilians. So firstly, perhaps the most famous one is the Anderson shelter, which was built in gardens and in allotments and in areas in which you had earth that could be covered on top of these corrugated iron, these bits of metal. They were very effective if a bomb landed nearby. If it was a direct hit, that was a different story. That was also true of the Morrison shelter as well, which was more like a cage that was placed in the home, such as under a table, which protected people from aerial bombardment that way. Considering their cost of being quite cheap to make, they were actually very effective, but if there was a direct hit, that would more or less be the end of that family.
The German assault on Britain was made possible by possession of French and Belgian airfields close to the Channel coast. With far greater distances to cover and not yet in possession of a really effective heavy bomber, the RAF's tit-for-tat was much less damaging than the Blitz. In October, to enhance the effectiveness of his assault, Hermann Goering made the decision to concentrate on night bombing.
The problem was that German bombers had moved towards bombing at night. However, bombing at night put a high premium on things such as bomb aiming and accuracy, getting the target.
The same month, on October 30th, the British bombing directive was issued that authorized area or carpet bombing against the enemy.
Area bombing was an idea adopted by Bomber Command in order to try and maintain accuracy on target. Instead of attacking a particular individual target, maybe a factory or a railway line, you are now attacking a wider area, perhaps a town, a city.
Winston Churchill put the intention of the area bombing directive plainly. Although not the target, the civilian population around the target areas must be made to feel the weight of war. On November 11th, a fleet of German bombers set off across the North Sea. After a British attack 3 days earlier on Munich, the German crews had been told that neither Hitler nor Goering was willing to let an attack on the capital of the Nazi movement go unpunished. Their target was not London, but Coventry in the Midlands. By dawn on November 15th, the heart of Coventry had been all but wiped out. The bombers, 437 Heinkel 111s, dropped 450 tons of both high explosive and incendiary bombs, including the first parachute mine. Parachute mines had been developed by the Germans from magnetic mines, which they'd used against shipping. The Royal Navy had discovered a way to eliminate the magnetic field around ships and demagnetize them, making magnetic mines obsolete. Instead, the Germans modified them into parachute mines. The sea mines were fitted with a timer and dropped by parachute from bombers. Timed to detonate at the level of rooftops rather than exploding on impact. The effect was a blast that sent shock waves over a wide area without any cushioning from neighboring buildings. There were different sizes of parachute mines. One was the Luftmine A at 500 kilograms. Another was the Luftmine B of 1,000 kilograms. When dropped in volume, they had a devastating effect.
The reason the Coventry raid in November 1940 was so successful was that the Germans were able to mark the target accurately and then get 400 to 500 bombers over the target in the course of a night, largely burning out the heart of the city.
It is not enough that the civil defense services should work like heroes and heroines. It is not enough to praise ambulance, rescue, and firefighting services. There are thousands of people who have not as yet been blitzed. And if there are any who feel that they can add something to the national effort, let them reflect on these pictures.
The cathedral at Coventry was left as a ruin. It's a very evocative, burned out shell as a symbol of the human cost of aerial bombing.
In the course of the bombardment, a firestorm was started which burned out much of the city center. 60,000 out of 75,000 buildings were destroyed or badly damaged, and 568 men, women, and children were killed. In the following week, raids of the scale of Coventry killed 484 civilians in London and 228 in Birmingham.
If you're having to dig a mass grave the next morning for that many people, that's going to affect the civilian population.
The total number of British civilians killed that November was 4,588.
What it didn't do was what Germany had hoped. It didn't cause this mass morale dent, and it didn't cause outcry for the end of the war.
On December 7th, 1940, British bombers struck back, hitting the German industrial city of Dusseldorf. On December 12th, the Germans bombed the British steel town of Sheffield. That day, the British War Cabinet authorized maximum possible destruction of a selected German town. 4 days later, Mannheim was bombed, with the deaths of 23 civilians. This bombing tit-for-tat culminated in a German response that would go unmatched until 1942. The warning sirens blared on December 29th, a little after 6 in the evening. One hour later, Luftwaffe bombers arrived over London. The first wave were Pathfinders, which dropped a punishing 10,417 incendiary bombs over 3 hours.
So the first wave, normally that would be high explosive and air mines, and the idea was to take out utilities, so gas, electricity, and water, to cut people off in terms of taking out roads, sections of roads, so the emergency services can't get through, to put out the many fires that the incendiary bombs in the further waves would cause. And those incendiaries contain petroleum or magnesium and iron powder, all of which are designed to cause fire and destruction.
"19 churches, 16 of them built by Christopher Wren after the first Great Fire, were destroyed. The whole of Paternoster went up in flames, destroying some 5 million books. The Guildhall was badly damaged. St. Paul's was ringed by fire. A section of the Roman wall, hidden for many hundreds of years, was uncovered by the bombing of Cripplegate.
All the world that is still free marvels at the composure and fortitude with which the citizens of London are facing and surmounting the great ordeal to which they are subjected, the end of which, or the severity of which, cannot yet be foreseen.
Dense cloud and poor visibility over northern France cancelled the remainder of what had been planned as a 9-hour bombardment. On February the 9th, 1941, Churchill addressed the nation.
An invasion now will be supported by a much more carefully prepared tackle and equipment of landing craft and other apparatus. We must all be prepared to meet gas attacks, parachute attacks, and glider attacks.
In fact, Churchill knew that what he was telling the people was unlikely. Code intercepts and other intelligence had informed him that Hitler had abandoned any idea of an invasion. But the Nazis were masters of misinformation, and Hitler was unpredictable at best. The day after Churchill's speech, the first true four-engined bomber to serve with RAF Bomber Command entered service. The Short Stirling. The Short Stirling was born from an RAF requirement set forth in 1936, calling for a heavy four-engined bomber with suitable range and a lethal payload. Powered by 4 Bristol Hercules radial engines spaced across its mid-mounted wing, with a maximum speed of 454 kilometers an hour at 3,800 meters.
Men and women go 50-50 in the building of the fuselage, and what a fuselage it is. It's so big it has to be built in sections, and the joining of the sections is like the shunting of a train.
A short wingspan of 30.2 meters allowed it to fit within a standard RAF hangar. This meant its wings were very thick, leading to a low-altitude ceiling, but greater maneuverability to outturn enemy night fighters. It was flown by a pair of pilots who were supported by a navigator bombardier, a front gunner wireless operator, 2 further gunners, and a flight engineer. The Stirling was armed with 8 7.7mm machine guns, 2 in a powered nose turret, 2 in a powered dorsal turret, and 4 in a powered tail turret for large arcs of fire. The bomb load was up to 6,350 kilograms. The bomb bay was divided into 3 parallel cells, meaning it could not hold the larger, more destructive bombs later in the war. It was relegated to second-line duties from late 1943, when the Avro Lancaster would take over frontline bombing duties. The Stirlings flew a total of 14,500 sorties, during which 27,000 tons of bombs were dropped. 2,383 Short Stirlings were eventually produced. On April 16, 1941, London received what Germany described as the greatest air raid of all time. And the bombers returned again with more force 3 nights later. The last mass bomber raid on the British capital began at 11:30 p.m. on Saturday, May 10th, and lasted until 5:37 a.m. on Sunday, May 11th. 507 Luftwaffe planes took part, dropping a total of 708 tons of bomb, with more than 1,000 people killed each night. It was the Luftwaffe's parting shot before their main forces headed east to wreak havoc on Soviet cities. As June gave way to July and then August without any further air raids, a London newspaper poster simply said, "Blitz over."
But there was no real prospect of these raids being strong enough or sustained enough to really cripple the British war effort. This was simply a way of keeping the pressure up on the British Isles. And in fact, the German military planners by spring of '41 were already thinking of turning the focus of their war effort to the Soviet Union.
A headline from the London Evening News read, "It's Moscow's turn now." On June 22nd, Axis forces launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union.
It's not too much of a stretch to claim that the war in the East, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was really the campaign that the Luftwaffe had been designed, created, and built to execute. The Chief of Staff of the German Air Force, when Barbarossa was announced, was heard to remark, "At last, a proper war."
The largest invasion force yet seen, 3.5 million troops, 80% of the German army with significant contributions by its allies, surged forward on a 2,800-kilometer front. The invasion was organized in 148 divisions, thrusting towards 3 initial goals: Army Group North to Leningrad, Army Group Center to Smolensk, and Army Group South to Kiev. 4 panzer groups with 3,400 tanks and close air support from 2,700 Luftwaffe aircraft led the assault. The Russian Red Army had 2.9 million troops in the Western District, 23,000 tanks, and over 2,700 aircraft available, but Soviet forces were thinly spread, often in indefensible positions and with poor equipment.
Barbarossa was seen as the campaign where the Luftwaffe could really shine and really redeem itself. The first focus of the Luftwaffe during the opening stages of Barbarossa was to attack the Red Air Force. And in the first 2 days, the Germans destroyed over 2,000 Soviet aircraft, mostly on the ground.
The panzer concentrations punched through Soviet defenses, assisted by the Luftwaffe destruction of 1,800 Soviet aircraft on the ground on the first day.
The Red Air Force was virtually knocked out of the war temporarily during the first weeks of the campaign. When the Red Air Force got off the ground, they were virtually annihilated.
They basically threw everything they had against the invading German forces to try and just slow them down. And that included using fighters as fighter bombers, and also twin-engine attack aircraft, the IL-2 single-engine attack aircraft, and even large, obsolete 4-engine bombers like the Tupolev TB3.
By July, German Army Group North was just 96 kilometers from Leningrad. Army Group Center had captured over 620,000 Soviet troops in the Bialystok-Minsk pockets and near Smolensk. Another 650,000 Russian troops were killed or captured in Kiev by September, and the fall of Kharkov followed in October.
It's not much more than a month ago since Mr. Molotov broadcast to the people of the Soviets, telling them of Hitler's latest criminal aggression, this time against them. These are some of the 180 million people against whom Hitler had just turned his war machine. And they fully understood what that meant. Same as for Britain and her other allies: blood, toil, tears, and sweat.
But as their supply lines became stretched, the German offensive inevitably slowed. Soviet troops were encircled, but would not surrender. And although poorly trained and unprepared, the Red Army had a seemingly limitless supply of men to replace those who were cut down. In addition, the Soviet Air Force successfully implemented the tactic of nuisance bombing to disrupt the German forces.
Nuisance bombing consisted of small aircraft like the U-2 or PO-2 biplane being used to attack German targets at night. Now, this doesn't cause a great deal of damage, but what it did was it robbed the Axis soldiers of maybe the most important commodity in wartime, and that's a decent night's sleep. And it kept them on edge. One of the things it did was it cleared away all the obsolete and obsolescent aircraft. For example, the obsolescent Tupolev SB was replaced by the much more modern PE-2 bomber.
The twin-engined three-seat fighter bomber Petlyakov PE-2 was one of the best ground attack aircraft of the war. And it was extremely successful in the roles of heavy fighter, reconnaissance, and night fighter, often flown by female pilots. It was designed by Vladimir Petlyakov, who had fallen foul of Stalin and was imprisoned in a Soviet gulag. His design was about to enter production when Soviet authorities reacted to the performance of the German Stuka attacks in Poland and ordered a swift redesign as a dive bomber within 45 days. The end result was so effective that Petlyakov was granted his freedom.
The PE-2 was well streamlined. It had initially been designed as a fighter, so it was quite fast in terms of the aircraft. As a matter of fact, it was as fast as a Bf-109E at around 5,000 meters.
A top speed of 580 kilometers an hour and good flying characteristics allowed accurate bombing missions and escape from hostile interceptors. Armaments comprised two 7.62mm SHKAS fixed forward-firing machine guns in the nose and two in the rear. It had a bomb load of 1,600 kilograms. Some models carried AG-2 aerial grenades launched from the tail to scatter shrapnel in the path of a pursuer, accounting for 1 out of every 5 aerial kills. At its height, the PE-2 comprised 75% of all Soviet twin-engined bombers in operation, with 11,430 built. As the German invasion pressed on deep into Soviet territory, a report presented to the British government questioned the RAF's bombing strategy.
It was instigated because the effects that were expected from strategic bombing were not being seen in German industrial production output and their ability to transport these forces through Germany and onto the Eastern Front.
Churchill's scientific advisor, Lord Cherwell, ordered a little-known civil servant and distinguished economist David Bensusan Butt to subject RAF claims to statistical analysis by comparing 633 bomb damage photos with the payloads carried by bombers. He found that on a good night with a full moon, 1 aircraft in 3 had got within 8 kilometers of its target, 1 in 10 when the Ruhr was obscured by fog, and just 1 in 20 on nights with no moon.
This was in stark contrast to what the pilots were saying as they came back from their raids and were being debriefed, where up to 90% of the crews were claiming they'd hit their target, i.e. they were within 5 miles of the designated target.
2 avenues were available to address these problems. One was to admit that precision bombing was unachievable and to opt instead for area bombing. The other was to develop the science and techniques which would make precision bombing viable. Both avenues were taken. At the same time as refining its targeting and bomb-aiming capabilities, the War Cabinet enacted a directive calling on Bomber Command to focus its offensive on the morale of the enemy's civil population. Heavy rains transformed the invasion routes into the Soviet Union into a mire of mud. The Russians called it Rasputitsa, the season of no roads. As the mercury plummeted, the lubricants in German engines congealed. The German High Command, based on the Red Army's poor performance in the winter war against Finland, had not planned for fighting in a Russian winter. But now they were bogged down in a landscape that was completely foreign to them, in a climate of harsh extremes, with supply lines at breaking point.
The overall strategy of Barbarossa was fatally flawed. For one thing, it was predicated on a 4-month blitzkrieg success. There was really no follow-on plan for what to do. Also, the Germans greatly underestimated the size of the forces that would be necessary to capture the Soviet Union. In both army strength and Luftwaffe strength, it looks very impressive. It looks like the Germans have millions of men and thousands of aircraft. But in fact, the Germans have fewer operational aircraft than they did for the Battle of France the previous year, which was a much more focused task.
On December 5th, Red Army General Georgy Zhukov launched a counterattack that threw Army Group Center back 240 kilometers. Hitler sacked Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, but nothing would now alleviate the war of attrition, which would ultimately destroy the German army on the Eastern Front.
War is a race, and the prize is victory. And the man who looks back over his shoulder and thinks he's got a lead may have nasty surprises coming to him.
On the night of November 7th, 1941, the biggest RAF force of the war so far, some 392 bombers, set off to targets in Cologne, Berlin, and other German cities. To reach the Reich, British bombers had to run a gauntlet of searchlights and night fighters, stretching from Denmark in the north to the French-Swiss frontier in the south. The gauntlet was known as the Kammhuber Line, after its designer, Major General Josef Kammhuber. They were caught between the enemy fighters and flak, and 37 British planes failed to return, nearly double the 5% loss rate deemed acceptable by Bomber Command. And among the bombers that headed for the Ruhr, the loss rate was a frightening 21%. Sir Charles Portal, Chief of the Air Staff, investigated the raid's failure and concluded that head of Bomber Command Sir Richard Pearce had displayed poor judgment in authorizing the attacks to go ahead, when weather reports showed that they should have been aborted.
Bomber Command had been really hemorrhaging its air crews over Nazi Germany, and it hadn't really been hitting much in return for that. And so, as a result, it knows that it needs to instill this sort of discipline and this ruthlessness that is necessary to win the war.
Bombing accuracy, bombing effectiveness was nowhere near up to pre-war expectations.
Pearce was sent to command air forces in the Far East, whilst a man of quite different character and talents was summoned to take his place, 49-year-old Sir Arthur Harris.
And he approached the idea of strategic bombing with a lot more vigor, and whilst he didn't necessarily change the strategy that was being adopted, he did carry it out with much more vigor, with much more emphasis on attacking German civilian morale and on attacking homes as well as attacking factories.
Each speck of light a blazing German building. Easy enough to realize the catastrophe, the concentrated chaos that is overwhelming the city below.
There are a lot of people who say that bombing can never win a war. Well, my answer to that is that it has never been tried yet, and we shall see.
But The way in which he really transforms Bomber Command is the discipline that he hammers in terms of making sure that the bomber waves are a lot more regimented. He starts to proceed over Bomber Command when it's starting to get its real heavy four-engine bombers, it's getting its Halifaxes and its Lancasters. And so there is this constant hard-hitting offensive that comes with Harris that starts to have immeasurably higher results.
3 years ago, Hitler boasted that he would rub out the cities of Britain, and more than 40,000 of our people were killed, and more than 120,000 were wounded. But now those who sowed the wind are reaping the whirlwind.
Under Arthur Bomber Harris, the bombing offensive would gather pace, absorbing 1/3 of Britain's military expenditure. And much effort would be spent on exploring the second avenue for improvement, science and method. The real problem was bomb sight technology. Aircrew faced 3 major problems: identifying the correct target at 20,000 feet through cloud, fog, and smoke, finding the exact point in space to release the weapon, and keeping a level flight path in heavy weather while evading enemy fire. The United States had been working on their own plans to deal with these problems. In 1939, the Swiss émigré Karl Norden and US Navy engineers achieved a remarkable feat. Their new Norden bomb sight technology, with over 2,000 moving parts and costing $1.5 billion to develop, could provide a stationary image of the target by compensating for an aircraft's change in motion, speed, drift, and altitude, and automatically drop the payload.
The Norden bomb sight was hailed as the most accurate bomb sight in the world. In the hands of a good bombardier, it was reasonably accurate.
The Air Force used to brag that they could put a bomb on a pickle barrel flying at 150 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Impossible. They couldn't do that.
In 1943, the RAF introduced a hand-built stabilized automatic bomb sight, the Saabs-2, which was produced in such limited numbers that it was issued only to No. 617 Squadron RAF, the Dam Busters. The RAF then used a combination of the US Norden bomb sight and their own unique radar guidance, the British oboe system. First used operationally in early 1943, it offered real-world accuracies greater than any optical bomb sight. Oboe was a radar navigational aid in which a control station in Britain broadcast a radar beam in the direction of the target, and another beam tracked an oboe-equipped Pathfinder bomber. The controller could then guide the aircraft directly to the target.
Now let me do that with anti-aircraft guns shooting at me, and now let me try and hit this target. The British figured out that they couldn't do it. And so what they start doing is nighttime area bombing.
You have to remember that the first job of anti-aircraft guns was to make bombers fly higher and be less accurate. So flak also broke up bomber formations, again, making them less accurate. It also frightened the bombardier in the bomber, which maybe made him toggle the bomb switch a little bit earlier.
Amid the challenges of precision bombing, even with improved equipment, area bombing, carpet bombing, was the strategy that Arthur Harris pursued ruthlessly. If you carpet bombed, it dramatically shortened the odds of hitting your designated target, even if you had to run the gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire. Just a month after Arthur Harris's appointment, the war was completely transformed by one of the most infamous bombing raids of the war, which occurred not in Europe, but in the unlikely location of Hawaii. Departing from northern Japan on November 25th, 1941, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto deployed the Imperial Japanese Navy's strategic advantage. It was built around its 6 main fleet aircraft carriers, the Coordinated Carrier Force, the first air fleet known as the Kido Butai, to strike the heart of the US Navy in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii.
The idea was that you'd use this mixed air group, 2 or 3 carriers bunched together, all 6 that the Japanese deployed at Pearl Harbor that they had. And the idea was that you'd use these aircraft to launch a strike against an enemy fleet or base over a distance of 150 to 200 miles, so they could get to the target, attack it, and get back again.
The first wave of attacks was carried out by a combination of Nakajima B-5N level torpedo bombers, A-6 M20 fighters, and D-3A1 Val dive bombers, which, at this point, were unparalleled in endurance and speed.
Out of a clear sky came the treacherous Japanese attack on Hawaii. The homes of Waikiki, famous in song, are burning fiercely from the bombs dropped by those planes.
They had a dive bomber, the Val, so if you wanted to hit a moving target at sea, such as an enemy vessel, naval vessel, you did it by dive bombing. See, a proportion of the Japanese air group at Pearl Harbor and during the Second World War on carriers was a dive bomber group.
The Val, the Aichi D-3A, was a carrier-based monoplane dive bomber that worked most effectively in tandem with IJN Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers. The D-3A was the first Japanese aircraft to bomb U.S. targets at Pearl Harbor and U.S. bases in the Philippines, and claimed the sinking of 16 Allied warships, more than any other Axis aircraft. The D-3A was fitted with a 1,299 horsepower Kinsei 54 14-cylinder air-cooled radial piston engine, and armed with 2 fixed 7.7mm machine guns and 1 flexible 7.7mm in the rear. It carried a 250-kilogram bomb under the fuselage and 2 60-kilogram bombs on wing racks. The Type 99 had an increased wing and tailspan, a telescopic gun sight, a radio, and a reflector compass to keep the aim steady in the dive. After the D-3A had been replaced by the Yokosuka D-4Y Suisei in 1944, its final use was in kamikaze missions. Following the D-3A Vals, the second wave of bombers focused on battleships. Commander of the Japanese carrier group, Vice Admiral Nagumo, then ordered the attackers to withdraw. Objectively, Pearl Harbor was a highly successful raid, killing over 2,300 personnel and injuring over 1,100. But it failed in one critical respect.
The thing they didn't get at Pearl Harbor were the American aircraft carriers. There were 2 deployed to Pearl Harbor at the time, and they were out on maneuvers at the time of the Pearl Harbor raids.
But the thing it did do, to the delight of Churchill and the British, was to force the world's most powerful industrial nation to join the conflict, in the Pacific and in Europe.
December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
There was now a new means to victory.